Good afternoon and welcome to the first day of the Charleston Literary Festival. I'm Diana Reich, founder and currently Senior Artistic Advisor at the festival. And I'm really delighted to present this session's speakers, Emily Wilson, furthest from me, and Judith Thurman, as well as to thank the sponsors for this event, Tom Taft, Kathleen Paramore, Michael Johnson, Martha and Orta Jackson. Thank you so much. It seems fitting to me that on this first day of the Charleston Literary Festival, we're celebrating Emily Wilson's magnificent translation of one of the founding texts of the Western literary canon, the Iliad, Homer's epic poem about the Trojan Wars, whose sequel, the Odyssey, she's also translated from the classical Greek. The stories describing the feats of heroes, heroines, gods and monsters have reverberated down the centuries and are constantly being reinterpreted due to their eternal truths about love, desire, grief, and conflict, the truths that they portray. And their cast list of memorable characters, Zeus, Apollo, Achilles, Odysseus, the beautiful Helen of Troy, to name but a few. There have been many translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey into English, but by current critical consensus, Emily Wilson's poetic translation of Homer's stories using contemporary idioms stand out as bravura and revelatory versions. Emily Wilson is Professor of Classical Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, a Fellow of the American Academy in Rome, also a Guggenheim and MacArthur Fellow. She now lives in America, but was born and brought up in the United Kingdom. Emily Wilson is joined on the platform by Judith Thurman, who's a staff writer at The New Yorker. She's also the biographer of the award-winning lives of the Danish author Isaac Dinesen, who was the inspiration for the film Out of Africa, and of the French writer Colette. It will now be my pleasure, my honor, to hand over to Emily Wilson and Judith Thurman to transport us to Homer's Troy.
I didn't reckon with the glasses and the microphone. Yes. Thank you for coming. It's an honor to be here. It's an incredible pleasure to be here with Emily. I did a profile of Emily for The New Yorker, and we went to Greece together, and I scampered in her wake up the hills of Ithaca. Before we will be conversing for 45 minutes, and then there'll be 15 minutes for your questions. Please don't be shy about asking questions. They should be questions, though, not statements. There'll be a mic, and wait for the mic so we can all hear them. And then afterwards, there'll be book signing in a different place, which I've forgotten. Before Emily and I start to talk, she's going to read you. She'll do 3 short readings from the Iliad. One of the most important things and moving things for me is to hear Emily, to hear the original Greek, and then to hear the translations, because one of the greatest aspects of this translation is Emily's unique voice. So.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm just going to start off at the beginning. So I'm going to do first the Greek and then my translation of the first few lines of the Iliad, which is called the Proem, and sets up some of the themes of the poem, and also, of course, introduces you to what does this poem sound like, first in the original in dactylic hexameter, not classical but Homeric Greek, which is a weird kind of language, and then in my translation, which is in iambic pentameter. Menenaide thea pelea doekeleos ulamenen hemuria kaiois alge atheca palas dipthimus psukasa di proiepsin heroon autuste haloria chuka kunesin oio noisi de pasi dios de teleto bule exudeta prota diaste tenerisanta Atredes Alexandron, kai Dios Achilles. So that, I'm going to do my translation, which of course can't match the original, but I'm trying to echo certain features of the original. Goddess, sing of the cataclysmic wrath of great Achilles, son of Peleus, that caused the Greeks immeasurable pain and sent so many noble souls of heroes to Hades and made men the spoils of dogs, a banquet for the birds. And so the plan of Zeus unfolded, starting with the conflict between great Agamemnon, lord of men, and glorious Achilles.
The voice, the music, the rhythm. You told me when we were speaking about the Iliad that I write for the body, and I would like you to talk about writing for the body, and something that you say in the introduction to the Iliad, that you strove for a voice of bronze, a voice of wind, a voice of fire. I needed to forge greatness without hyperbole, power without pomposity, as massive as a mountain, as soft as night, as powerful as sleep.
Yes, I mean, I certainly there's obviously a hyperbolic passage evoking what I'm trying to do, and of course it's impossible to always live up to that goal. And of course, you know, the original is such a great poem. It's very, very difficult not to be sort of constantly daunted by the task of trying to evoke something like this very, very intense experience of this poem, which is both monumental in length, in that it's 24 books long. It's even longer than the Odyssey, which is also 24 books, but the Iliad's books are longer, and that it has this monumentality, but then also this intensity, that it's, even though it evokes the whole Trojan War, it's only evoking a month and a half of that whole time, and in that month and a half, everything happens, even though nothing happens. It's just a squabble between two Greek warriors, and yet it evokes the whole experience of war and of living in a mortal human body, and of the intersection of the three societies, the divine society, the Trojan society, and the Greek society. I mean, just on the sort of most basic technical level, the Homeric poems were experienced in antiquity primarily out loud, performed by rhapsodes, and I wanted to create translations that would invite reading out loud, and that would both have a regular meter in English that would be audible to the Anglophone reader. Even if she or he isn't thinking about meter, you're still going to be noticing something rhythmical is going on, and also echoing things like the alliteration and the sort of sound patterns of the original, which again I can't do in exactly the same ways that the original does it, because the whole sound system of every language is different, as well as syntax is different, metaphor is different. But I could do things to evoke metricality, read aloud ability, performability, proto-dramatic qualities of the original.
But you've also made the point, which is really important. So many, look, the Iliad has been translated for at least 400 years. Mm-hmm. The Odyssey was earlier, I think. Chapman would be 500 years now. And
Chapman did both. The Iliad, and in fact, he started with the Iliad.
Oh, he did? Okay. Yes. So there have been endless translations. And many of the more recent ones, which you probably, some of you are familiar with, have a kind of, they're daunting, they're intimidating, and they're very formal, and they sort of evoke antiquity, they're archaic. And your idea was to, which you will tell us more, but to create an experience for the modern reader that was much closer to the experience that the ancient Greeks had. It wasn't archaic to them, and it was supposed to be an entertainment as much as a sort of a high culture moment.
I mean, I guess I actually do think it was archaic to them in a certain sense, and I actually wanted to evoke the traditionalness of the originals. I mean, I felt that some of the 20th and 21st century translations are actually too chatty, and that there's this way that many of them are in free verse, they don't have traditional poetic form, and that many of them use quite a lot of contemporary American slang, which of course dates very quickly and doesn't have that sense of this is a kind of language that has been passed down by many generations of poetic storytelling. So I actually wouldn't say that my goal was to be more modern than a translator like Stanley Lombardo. I think his is actually in some ways much more modernizing than mine is. His is free verse and has a ton of military slang in it. And the warriors in the Iliad calling each other buddy. I definitely didn't want to do that. I wanted to have a language which could seem traditional, even though it also had a clarity and emotional directness.
You use a lot of monosyllables. It's kind of plain song, and so you can read it with a certain speed. I remember after reading it several times and reading other versions of it. When I finished the profile, I took the Iliad back to bed with me because I just for the reading experience of reading it straight through, and because it's very suspenseful.
It's a great story. Yes, it is.
So you've worked between the Odyssey and the Iliad. You spent 10 years translating Homer, which is the amount of time that it took Odysseus to get home from Troy. And I'm sure you've had your caves and your shipwrecks along the way. But you said it was a very personal journey for you, and that your own experiences as a mother, as a child, as a woman. Influenced the translation. Can you tell us a bit about your personal relationship also to the characters in the book? You said to Achilles, and especially to Achilles and to Hector.
Yes, I mean, this is something which I find hard to talk about, and I'm not sure that I think of. I mean, while I'm actually doing the work, I don't think about any of that stuff. I mean, obviously, you and I talked for a personal profile, so that to me is quite a different relationship to the work than the relationship I usually have. Because the relationship to the work that I usually have is to do with, I'm going to read and reread this passage and think about what's going on in this passage, and then reread the commentaries about this passage, read the original out loud, do a draft. I'm thinking about how does this literary text work? How does this poetic text work in its own terms and within the texture of what might that word be doing in that line? I'm not sort of reflecting on my own biography most of the time. I realize that, of course, you can't spend 10 or 12 years sort of intensely working on these just two texts over and over and working on them every day without it being part of your life. And of course, I've also been reading and thinking about and teaching these texts for many decades before I started the translations. I tend to think that I think the more important sort of questions to do with my relationship with the text have to do with my sort of quasi-professional backgrounds. I mean, the way that, as you can hear and as you already were told, I grew up in the UK and then have spent the second 25 years of my life in the US. So I'm very conscious of the way that Homer in particular and ancient texts in general are taught and experienced and related to differently in the two countries. And that definitely influenced what I felt needed to be done in terms of creating a different translation. I had a particular 20 years worth of experiences of talking about these texts to American undergraduates, which has also shaped my sense of what could and couldn't be done with the existing translations. I also have a degree in English literature as well as in classics, the sense of realizing that the English language has this amazing capacities in terms of its poetic range, and that there are possibilities in terms of sort of poetry can borrow from high-class poetry can borrow from ballads. There's this whole sort of range of discourses and registers that the English language can have that I can use to echo what is going on in the Homeric texts. And of course, on some level, probably my own experience of parenthood and of being a child and of rage and grief, those things might get in there somewhere. But to me, it's very hard to actually join the dots about how did they get in there. The things that are conscious are much more the things about what exactly is going on with that line, and how could I look up that word and learn more about what's going on with that word.
I was very struck about you speaking about Thetis, the mother of Achilles, who you said it's really a poem about the pain of a goddess mother who can't protect a mortal child. Mm-hmm. And would you sort of say more about that? Because it's a sort of striking and in some ways original point of view about this poem, which is most of the focus is always on Achilles and Hector. It's not a focus on Thetis and the women in the poem. But
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's actually, I wouldn't want to claim originality for that. I think there's been, plenty of wonderful Homeric scholars, because there's been a whole couple of generations of wonderful literary Homeric scholars who've pointed out the obvious fact that both the Iliad and the Odyssey the action is shaped by a goddess who has a protege in the mortal world. In the case of the Odyssey, obviously it's Athena, whose protection and desire to generate honor for her protege Odysseus is what propels the plot. And in the case of the Iliad, it's Thetis, whose desire to protect the honor of her short-lived child Achilles is what propels the plot. And of course, in both cases, there are sort of questions about how much can a goddess achieve, even a goddess, achieve for a mortal man, who's always going to have limits to his power. And in the case of Achilles, of course, the generation of more honor for Achilles has both, as you heard in the first lines of the poem, terrible consequences for his own side, for his fellow Greeks. There's this whole paradox that the rage of Achilles and his desire, the wrath of Achilles, his desire to recoup his own honor entails doing, in most cases, a Homeric warrior generates honor by killing people on the other side. Achilles generates honor by causing death on his own side. And because Thetis has made it be the case that while Achilles sits sulking in his tent doing nothing but beach, that there will be this massacre of the Greek warriors. And that, of course, Achilles hasn't thought through. The massacre of the Greek warriors may include the only Greek warrior he cares about, which is Patroclus. And that will then also will make his own swift death run even more swiftly towards him, such that the mother's prayer, that she's done all the work to take care of him, and all she's done is both increase his unhappiness and shorten his life even more.
What, in your great care and precision in translating from the ancient Greek, the kinship and social relations of this world, you point out that the 21st century readers and listeners may see the inequalities in the poem's social worlds with particular clarity. The emotional intensity of representation of conflict feels in tune with the anguish and partisanship of our era. Seems like a good day to bring that up. So especially the relationships in the household with enslaved people and free people and the class systems. Could you talk about how this was something that was not paid a lot of attention to in previous translations?
Yeah, I mean, again, obviously it's debatable about what I can't see into the minds of my colleagues. What I can see is their work. I would say that it's surprising to me how many translations, including quite recent ones, seem to obscure or muddle power relationships in certain ways. I mean, including calling characters who are clearly enslaved, not using the word slave, or avoiding that in certain ways, and using words like servant, which doesn't make clear that this is a society in which enslavement is normalized. And then even beyond the household, of course, in the Iliad, one of the central questions is, what's the relationship between the elite warriors on whom most of our attention is focused, and then the laoi, the general troops, some of whom most of whom we're told at various points have been forced into battle and are shoved in the middle between the warriors, beating them behind, as Odysseus does with his golden staff when he beats up Thersites in Book 2. And of course, most of them will die without even getting what the elite warriors get, which is a name that lasts forever, which is supposed to be what makes it all worthwhile. Most people in the world of the Iliad die without any hope of that.
Among the least slanted, trying to sort of take a particular temporal bias out of the text, which is impossible to do perfectly. There's always going to be some bias in the text. You also talk about forging a relationship of trust with your reader, that they can trust that you are trying to give something that is as accurate and unbiased as possible. You're trying to be as transparent as possible, so that they can sort of experience Homer. What are some of the obstacles to that you have stumbled on in the way?
Yeah, I mean, I'm conscious that there are definitely readers out there and also even more non-readers out there who assume that I will have enormous amounts of bias. Because all the coverage of my Odyssey translation had the word woman in the title.
Right.
It was all framing my work entirely in terms of gender, which I think is extremely limiting and potentially anti-feminist. But because all of that happened, that then meant that I've always been seen as radical feminist translator, which I actually think has almost nothing to do with my work. But that's put onto both the Iliad and the Odyssey, and I think if anyone knew that I've done some other translations, that would presumably be put onto them too, but no one seems to care about Seneca very much, so for whatever reason, I don't know why. But so I was very conscious in writing the translator's note for the Iliad that there's a hermeneutics of suspicion that I've got to be then writing back to, and I've got to be aware that there will be readers who will be sort of combing through, looking for, is she either for good or for ill, sort of declaring something about this is her completely gender objectified woman's perspective on this poem. And I sort of wrestled with how much can I be authentic about the fact that in fact I think every interpretative labor that one can do, whether it's writing history or writing journalism or writing literary criticism, you're always approaching the work with a certain set of questions. You're also, if you're trying to do good work, you're trying to both be responsible about all the elements of truth that are out there in terms of how do you convey a narrative, and you're also trying to ask different questions and put the narrative together in a somewhat different way, otherwise there's no point in doing it. And that's the case with translation as well. I mean, I didn't feel that what I was doing primarily was about a particular rejiggering of personal perspectives, but about a particular rejiggering of poetic and voice kinds of perspectives. But what even is bias? I mean, I think it's to do with having a sense of, if I approach this scene with one set of assumptions, or this character with one set of assumptions, I need to dig deep into both myself and the text and think through, does the text feel the way about Agamemnon that I did when I first read the Iliad? Many readers have felt this poem is very hostile to Agamemnon. He's the greatest, richest leader who seems to be constantly making idiotic decisions, which have terribly bad consequences. Does the Iliad itself think that Agamemnon is an idiot as a leader? And I think it sort of does, but not entirely. I think it has sympathy even for Agamemnon, and certainly has sympathy for almost every, I mean, I can't think of a Homeric character for whom the text doesn't have some kind of sympathy. And so for me, it was, in the case of Homer in particular, it was about sort of digging into not just the texture of this particular phrase or line, but also the sort of quasi-novelistic task of thinking my way inside the characterization of what would this character sound like, what kinds of empathy does this text have for this character, and how can I make sure that that's audible in whatever I'm doing in English.
Well, I'm not going to try to gender empathy, but I think that one of the ways in which you come closest to Homer is the empathy. I always, to confess to you, I had read the Iliad in college, and then I tried to read it again, and I was always sort of bored by the machismo and bored by the fighting and it seemed it wasn't interesting to me. And Emily changed that, and she changed it she makes the vulnerability of these violent, angry men. She really brings it home, and the way in which men are damage themselves. They're ashamed. Mm-hmm. They're made to sort of. But you say this because this is really, I think, a unique quality of your translation is the ability to sympathize with these violent, brutal men.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, I certainly sympathize very, very deeply, and I think ever since I've been reading the Iliad, I've sort of felt there's something so powerful about the way that grief and rage are intertwined in the Iliad, and that Achilles' rage comes from his profound grief at the awareness that he, for most of the poem, doesn't want to let himself have, that he's going to die soon. He's going to lose lots of things that he cares about, and then he will be dead. And that he's sort of grasping for, at least I don't lose that. At least I won't lose my honor. Oh, I lost my honor. At least I won't lose my Patroclus, at least I'll get my own back, at least I'll get revenge. And then as it turns out, we're all going to lose. And those who mind most desperately about that and refuse to accept losses are the ones who cause most damage and most losses to others, but also to themselves. Yeah.
Exactly, and the fragility, the fragility in these sort of heroic figures is really moving. That's again, it's not about it's not about the voice of a woman, because you're right, it was sort of endless sexist repetitions of the first woman to do this and the first woman to do that. And as you pointed out, there have been many women Homerists, many women.
Been women Homer translators into other languages too. It's also the provincialism of thinking if it's not in English, then it doesn't count.
Yes.
I think it's actually related to the other kinds of provincialism about thinking ancient literature can't be moving or interesting or narratively or poetically sophisticated because it's ancient, so it must be primitive and boring. Which I think some translators sort of buy into that sense of it's from back in the day, so it's more or less unreadable, but scholars like it for some unknown reason.
No, it's like going to church on Sunday and sitting quietly in the pew and listening. And yes, it's exactly not like that. It's not a recognition. So I'd like you to, we'll pause for another reading, but there are three goddesses who start the Trojan War, and then three women whose grieving voices end it. And one of them is Hecuba, and I think you're going to read the...
I was going to read Hector and
Andromache.
Andromache, yes. Andromache is one of the grieving voices.
Yes, and just set the scene for people who may not.
Yes, so the Iliad is a very surprising poem about the Trojan War in that it doesn't have most of the story. And instead, as I already said, it focuses on just a tiny bit of the Trojan War narrative, which is neither the beginning nor the end. It doesn't have the judgment of Paris with the judgment between the three goddesses about who's most beautiful, doesn't have the abduction of Helen by Paris, doesn't have the muster of the troops at Aulis and Agamemnon killing his daughter, doesn't have how does the war start. It has all of those things implicitly, but it doesn't actually narrate any of them directly. And instead, we have this sort of strange focus on the wrath of Achilles, how Achilles sits out of the fighting. And for the first 2/3 of the poem, the most extraordinary and exciting character isn't present. So it is doing all these weird things with the narrative. And in the absence of Achilles, the great Trojan warrior, Hector, makes great progress in making his way towards the Greek ships in order to try to set fire to them, to destroy not just the besieging Greek army and to besiege the besiegers, but also to ensure that the Greeks don't get a journey home. So the bit I'm going to read is where Hector, the brother of Paris, abductor of Helen, is insisting that he's going to leave his family back in the city and go fight at the front lines of the Trojan troops to lead them towards the Greek ships to fight in the most dangerous way possible. And I'm going to read a little bit of the scene. Hector has already resisted the pleas of his parents to stay inside the city, relax for a little while, take care of himself for a little while, because they all know that he may be going out to his death. And now I'm going to read the scene in which he says the final goodbye to his wife, Andromache, who also begs him to fight more defensively rather than to risk almost certain death by fighting at the front of the lines to take on Achilles and to take on the Greeks in Achilles' absence. So I'll just read a tiny bit of the Greek and then I'll read more of the passage in English. Toihomen me desinidonis paidasiupe, Andromache de hoianki paristata, da cruceusa, entarahoi fuceria postapad ekdonamazde. Daimon here, sisi seltoson menos, udilla aires paidet naek piacon, kai amaron, het takakera suesomai. Hector dashed out of the house and back the way he came, through the great town, along the well-kept streets. And when he reached the Scaean gates, which led out to the battlefield, she ran to meet him, Andromache, the wife for whom he gave so many gifts, to take her as his bride. She ran to meet him, and the slave came too, bringing the baby cuddled in her arms. He was so little still and innocent. Now Hector saw his child and smiled at him in silence, saying nothing. Andromache stood next to him in tears, grasping his hand, and spoke his name and said, "What are you doing, Hector? You strange man! Your will to fight will kill you. Do you feel no pity for your little baby son, or my unhappiness, my life of loss? Soon I shall be your widow. Soon the Greeks, all of them rushing at you all at once, will kill you. And for me, when I have lost you, better that I sink down below the earth. There can be no more comfort afterwards for me when you are dead, but only pain. I have no father and no noble mother, because godlike Achilles killed my father. Hector, you are my father and my mother. You are my brother and the vigorous man whose bed I share. Please, think of me, have pity, and stay here on the wall. Please do not make your son an orphan and your wife a widow." Great Hector in his flashing helmet answered, "Woman, I care about all these things too, but I feel overwhelming shame in front of the Trojan women in their trailing dresses, and Trojan men if I shrink back from war as if I were a coward. And my spirit tells me I must not stop, for I have learned always to be a warrior and fight among the frontline champions of Troy, to win great glory for the king my father and for myself. You see, my heart and mind know this for sure, that there will be a day when holy Troy will be destroyed, and Priam, lord of the Ashward spear, and all our people. But no one matters more to me than you. No pain that anyone in Troy will suffer, not even Hecuba or High King Priam, not even all my many noble brothers who will be slaughtered by our enemies and fall amid the dust in days to come. No pain of theirs affects me more than yours. One day some bronze-ardent Greek will capture you, and you will weep, deprived of all your freedom, and you will weave to serve another woman in Argos. You will have to carry water from River Hipporea or Messeis, entirely against your will, but forced by strong necessity. And sometimes people will see you weeping there, and they will say, that woman used to be the wife of Hector, who was the greatest champion of Troy during the Trojan War. When they say that, your pain and grief will feel brand new again, because you do not have a man like me to save you from the day of your enslavement. But as for me, I hope I will be dead and lying underneath a pile of earth, so that I do not have to hear your screams or watch when they are dragging you away." The noble Hector reached towards his son. The baby wailed and wriggled back to snuggle into his well-groomed nurse's lap and dress. The child was scared by how his father looked, shocked at the terrifying horsehair plume that nodded at the top part of his helmet. His loving father and his mother laughed. Hector immediately took off his helmet and put it on the ground. It glittered brightly. Then glorious Hector kissed his darling son and took him in his arms to rock and cuddle and prayed to Zeus and all the other gods. "Zeus and you other gods, please let my son be just like me, admired among the Trojans, strong and successful on the battlefield, and powerful enough to rule in Troy. I hope they say, when he comes back from war, this man is so much better than his father. I hope he kills an enemy of ours and brings his blood-stained arms and armor back and makes his mother happy." With these words, he gave his son to his beloved wife. She let him snuggle in her perfumed dress, and tearfully she smiled. Her husband noticed and pitied her. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Strange woman, come on now. You must not be too sad on my account. No man can send me to the house of Hades before my time. No man can get away from destiny, first set for us at birth, however cowardly or brave he is. Go home and do the things you have to do. Work on your loom and spindle, and instruct the slaves to do their household work as well. War is a task for men, for every man born here in Troy, but most especially me." When he had finished speaking, glorious Hector picked up his helmet with its horsehair plume. His loving wife set off for home, but kept twisting and turning back to look at him. More and more tears kept flooding down her face. Quickly she reached the rich and well-built house of Hector, killer of men, and there she found a multitude of women slaves inside. She prompted all of them to start lamenting, and so they grieved in his own house for Hector while he was still alive. They knew that he would never come back home again from war.
I would really just rather have Emily stand at the podium and read first the Greek and then the English. It seems, reading the Iliad this week, last week, now, with everything that's on the news, not just here, but elsewhere in the world. And you wrote, this was before a lot of this, we're now in a period of crisis, not for a specific nation, but for humanity. What does reading the Iliad now, how does that illuminate this moment?
Yeah, I mean, the Iliad has always been read and reread in the light of whichever war is happening.
Right.
But of course, there were always wars. I mean, there were always both, international wars and then also local conflicts. And so many people sort of live in neighborhoods where there are conflicts in particular cities and particular cultures. I mean, to me, the Robert Fagel's translations have an introduction by Bernard Knox, which is sort of very explicitly framing the Iliad in terms of Knox's own experience as a veteran of the Second World War, and it's sort of presented as a greatest generation kind of Iliad. And then the Stanley Lombardo translations are sort of almost explicitly presented as here's the Vietnam kind of Iliad. And the Caroline Alexander translation of the Iliad was often read as a post-9/11 kind of Iliad. I sort of thought about, am I trying to tie this, in either consciously or unconsciously, am I tying this to a particular moment? And I mean, obviously there are wars which are going on now, which were not going on while I was working on this poem. I mean, on the translation
but they
of this
do
poem.
speak to it.
But they absolutely speak to it. I mean, I think the power of the poem is that it can resonate with so many different conflicts around the world, and also in this country. I think there are so many ways that it's truthful about how conflict in one society creates conflict in another society. I think that's one way that it resonates with the sort of complexity of war that happens far away from the United States is actually implicated with what's going on in terms of partisanship and conflict within the United States in ways that are arguably sort of parallel to the conflicts that are happening on Olympus between Hera and Zeus impact what's going to happen in the conflicts between Hector and Paris in Troy and between Agamemnon and Achilles in the Greek encampment. All of those conflicts are intertwined together, and the inter-society conflict emerges from conflicts that are sort of nascent there in the societies, within the societies. I mean, the bit that you read, I thought a lot about the way that the Iliad is about from that passage that I just read, how Achilles has had a prophecy that he's going to die from his goddess mother. He has the horse's mouth, and in fact the literal horse's mouth, because he has immortal horses who are also able, the great thing about having immortal horses is that they can tell you will die. And that's the useful information that immortal horses or immortal mothers can pass along, which you might not otherwise know. But even Hector, even though he doesn't have those immortal accoutrements, he also kind of knows he's going to die. And that each of these characters has this sort of vulnerability of knowing we're fighting in a world that's where it's both that individuals are striving for something immortal, like immortal fame, an aphthiton kleos, but then we also know that we might not get it. There's that amazing passage in the middle of the poem where we hear what will happen afterwards to this whole landscape where the Greeks have built their great wall. Apollo and Poseidon will cause all the rivers to flood. The landscape will be transformed by the divinely sent flood of the rivers, and there will be nothing left of any of these people who are striving so hard to be remembered. All we might have left is words. And I think that resonates with so many things in terms of just how do people try so hard to get control of the narrative. And I think the Iliad is also smart about how rhetoric is part of what is part of how war works, right? It's not just fought with weapons. It's not just about the guns and the tanks and the bombs. It's not just in the Iliad about the spears. It's also about the speeches. And if you haven't read Homer recently, you may be surprised by, of course, there are lots and lots of massacre sequences, but also those sequences of physical violence are intertwined with verbal violence. And that also seems to me really important for thinking about conflicts today. Nowadays.
Yes. Also the hierarchy of gods and mortals, because the sense of strings being pulled and of the sort of caprice of the gods towards the mortals, and their internecine wars, and their sort of objectifying and making mortals do their bidding for reasons that will kill the mortals or ruin their lives or destroy their cities. So there's this sort of sense of a cosmology that feels also relevant to...
Absolutely relevant, yes. I mean, that chilling passage where Hera and Zeus are, as usual, arguing, and they do the deal where Zeus will let Hera obliterate Troy, a city that he loves, and in return, Hera will let 3 cities that she loves get obliterated.
Yes,
and
exactly.
The consequence, of course, is on the human level, is that 4 more human cities get obliterated. And on the divine level, it just means that Hera and Zeus can avoid destroying each other for another few millennia.
Exactly. Before there's going to be, we'll have time for questions. I wanted to ask you, because in our last text exchange, you said that you were working on Lucan and the idea of the end of a republic. Would you tell us how do you transition from Homer to a next subject, but tell us about what the next stage is, and if it is.
I'm actually not doing Lucan. I was doing a podcast about Lucan, but I'm not doing a project of any particular publishing kind about Lucan. I'm doing a translation of Ovid's Heroides, which is a really fun project. It's very different in style. It's sort of the same world, because it starts with Penelope writing her verse epistle to Odysseus saying, "What took you so long?" And then there's one which is Briseis, which again is sort of funny, though. One can argue about how funny is the joke about Briseis treating Achilles as if he wasn't her enslaver, who never shows any interest in her whatsoever, but rather her romantic partner, who seems to be bizarrely unloving towards her. It's a very different tone and, of course, different verse form from Homer, and I'm having a lot of fun doing that. And I'm also doing a sort of retelling of those stories that are in the background to the Trojan War,
wonderful.
But as sort of as short stories.
What are they? Which ones? Or a couple?
A lot.
A lot.
A lot. I mean, it's going to be something like 40 linked short stories.
So this is the Apocrypha, or the stuff that doesn't make it into the Iliad?
The stuff that's sort of in the background. I mean, so for instance, in the Iliad, there were several references to the first Trojan War, the first mythical Trojan War,
right.
When Heracles sacked Troy. And the landscape is marked by the wall behind which Heracles had to hide when escaping from the sea monster. So I'm doing a whole telling about how was his Cyanide Trojan princess tied to the rock and escaping from the fight with the sea monster, the abduction of Ganymede. There are lots of stories that come up mostly in much later sources or in the commentaries on the ancient commentaries on the Iliad.
But this is your narrative; it's not a translation.
It's my narrative.
Oh, wonderful! And are you doing sort of the what happens after the war, the killing of Priam by Hercules?
I haven't got to that part yet, but I think so. Yeah.
I think you should do that. I want to leave time for questions. There's a last reading, and it's to give you a different tone. That is also, this is a poem with so many tones, and this is not about throwing babies off the parapets or...
Not just about that, yes.
Yeah.
There is that, yes. So should I do Hera and Zeus for comedy, or should I do Priam and Achilles, which is a little bit shorter?
Oh, yeah.
I can shorten it a little bit. I can do either one. I mean, Zeus is funnier, but we don't have to go with funny if we don't want funny.
Okay, all for funny, raise your hands. All right, there you go.
Which do we want?
Funny one.
Funny, okay. I mean, I actually have to do sort of content warning because I'm going to end up not being funny, but there is at least a little bit of fun in it. So this is from book 14, when Gods, of course, have their own particular superpowers, but they're also, if they're clever, as the gods of Homer are, able to borrow superpowers from each other. So in Book 14, Hera, the sister and wife of Zeus, who doesn't like that the Trojans are doing well and wants to get the Trojans to be killed quicker and to have the destruction of to hasten the destruction of Troy, doesn't like the plan that Zeus has hatched with Achilles' mother Thetis to delay the fall of Troy, so that Achilles can get honored by the Greeks seeing the necessity of him fighting. So Hera takes on borrows the sexy accessories from Aphrodite, whose special province they are, so that she can seduce Zeus and make him take a really solid nap, so he'll be distracted, and therefore she can cause bad things to happen to the Trojans on the battlefield. Zeus, the god of strategy, turns out to be terrible at strategy when it comes to either seeing through what his wife is doing or coming up with he gives the worst shut-up speech in the world and thinks it's going great because it seems to work. Meanwhile, Hera quickly came up to the peak of Ida, Gargaron, and Zeus, who gathers clouds together, saw her, and at the sight of her, desire enfolded his cunning mind, as when they first made love and went to bed together secretly, so that their loving parents would not know. He stood in front of her and said to her, "Hera, what do you want? Why have you come down from Olympus to this place? You brought no horses and no chariot to ride." Deceitfully, the goddess Hera answered, "Husband, I am about to go and visit the limits of the earth where food is grown, to see the origin of all the gods, Ocean and Mother Tethys. In their house they cared for me and nurtured me, and now I plan to visit them and stop their quarrel. But I have come out here from Mount Olympus because you would be angry with me later if I had failed to tell you I was going to visit Ocean, where the streams run deep." Then Zeus, who gathers clouds together, answered, "You can go later on that journey, Hera, but now let us enjoy some time in bed. Let us make love. Such strong desire has never suffused my senses or subdued my heart for any goddess or for any woman as I feel now for you. Not even when I lusted for the wife of Ixion and got her pregnant with Pirithous, a counselor as wise as any god. Not even when I wanted Danae, the daughter of Acrisius, a woman with pretty ankles, and I got her pregnant with Perseus, the best of warriors. Not even when I lusted for the famous Europa, child of Phoenix, and I fathered Minos on her and godlike Rhadamanthus. Not even when I wanted Semele, or when in Thebes I lusted for Alcmene, who birthed heroic Heracles, my son, and Semele gave birth to Dionysus, the joy of mortals. And not even when I lusted for the goddess Queen Demeter, who has such beautiful, well-braided hair. Not even when I wanted famous Leto. Not even when I wanted you, yourself. I never wanted anyone before as much as I want you, right now. Such sweet desire for you has taken hold of me." Deceitfully, the goddess Hera answered, "Terrible, terrifying, son of Kronos, what have you said? You want to make love now, upon the peace of Ida, a place where everything is visible, all that? But what if one of the immortal gods witnesses us up there in bed together and goes away and tells the other gods? I could not get up from the bed and go back to your house. It would be very shameful. But if this really is your heart's desire, you have a chamber which our dear son built. Hephaestus fixed strong doors into the frame. Let us go lie down there, if you are really so tempted by the thought of making love." Then Zeus, the god who gathers clouds, replied, "Do not be frightened that some god or human might see us, Hera. I will wrap around us a golden cloud, so we cannot be seen, even by Helios the sun, whose vision is sharpest and whose light sees everything." With this, the son of Kronos took his wife into his arms, and underneath them both the bright earth grew fresh grass and dewy clover, and thick, soft hyacinth, which kept them up above the ground. On this plant bed they lay, surrounded by the lovely golden cloud, which sprinkled shining drops of dew upon them. Then Zeus the father slept in peace up high on Gargaron, subdued by sleep and sex, and held his wife enfolded in his arms. So then he takes his solid nap, and meanwhile, sleep rushes down to tell Poseidon to rouse the warriors. And that was going to be just one more minute. So we get battle sequence, and we get to hear how the machinations of the gods affect the mortals. When every man was dressed in shining bronze, they charged ahead, led by the god of earthquakes, Poseidon. In his sturdy hand he held a deadly sharp-edged sword that shone like lightning. It is decreed that nobody may fight this terrifying blade in bitter battle. Fear seizes every man when it appears. And meanwhile, on the other side, great Hector marshaled the Trojan troops. Blue-haired Poseidon and noble Hector pulled the rope of war, creating an intense and dreadful conflict. One led the Trojans and one helped the Greeks. The sea surged up towards the huts and ships. The armies clashed with a tumultuous cry. Louder than roaring of the waves on shore when cruel blasts of Boreas have stirred the deepest water. Louder than the rumble of blazing fire that leaps to burn a forest within the thickets on the mountainside. Louder than wind that shrieks through lofty oak trees, which roars the loudest when it rages most. Louder than all of these, the Greeks and Trojans let out their terrifying screams and cries as they attacked each other. Shining Hector aimed with his spear at Ajax, who had turned to face him head-on. Hector did not miss. He struck the straps across the chest of Ajax, which held his shield and silver-studded sword. The son of Telamon had tied him on, and they protected his soft flesh. Then Hector was angry that his sharp spear caused no damage. Frustrated, he rejoined his group of comrades. But mighty Ajax, son of Telamon, hit him as he retreated with a stone. Numerous rocks, the swift ship's anchor stones, rolled at the fighter's feet, and Ajax seized one of these stones and hurled it straight at Hector, over his shield rim, and it hit his chest under his throat and sent him whirling round, just as a spinning top is struck and spun, as when the father, Zeus, strikes down and fells an oak tree by the roots, and as it falls there is a strange, uncanny smell of sulfur, and anyone who sees it is afraid. So swiftly Hector tumbled to the ground, the mighty fighter fallen in the dust.
We have time for a few questions. Hopefully, kind of brief. If you make the questions brief, Emily can give longer answers. Yes. Do we have microphones for the? Yes. This gentleman here. Yeah.
Julian James wrote a book on the origin of consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral mind back in the 60s, and he makes the case that the Iliad and the Odyssey are the transition between the dominance of the right brain to the left brain. And an example he uses is the Achilles, who said the gods made me do it, and Odysseus used the ego and said, I took responsibility for that. Is there any development on that in the last 50 years? And what do you think about that?
I mean, classicists tend not to take it very seriously, and I have to admit I'm one of the people who doesn't take it very seriously. I think the evidence is very strong that the Iliad and the Odyssey, even if they're not by the same poet, are from the same era, and the idea that there's a sort of historical development from one to the other seems to me very dubious. And then also the idea that he relies very, very heavily on the idea that these poetic representations of how action and consciousness work must be exactly correspondent to how everyone in archaic Greece thought about consciousness, which again seems to be methodologically very dubious. I mean, you could watch, a Roadrunner cartoon and think, okay, so Americans in the 1950s felt that motion happens with this strange, like if you run off a cliff, you all have to pause for a minute and then you fall. But then, a later period of American history, people realized that gravity actually exists and you do fall off the cliff. I mean, it's about a particular representational mode, and the artifice of the poems goes beyond that there are goddesses who interact directly with humans into the way that the poems have conventions about how does decision-making happen, which is usually through the double causation of there's a deity and there's also a human being, which I don't think it necessarily means that that's exactly how everyone always thought about it all the time in the 7th century BC.
Thank you. Yes, right there. Yeah.
Hi. This festival has an English genesis, and I wanted to know if you would elaborate about what you said earlier about how English and American audiences differ and how they read the epics.
Thank you for that. Yes, I mean, partly I was thinking, when I say that, I'm partly thinking just about the fact, like, more broadly about pedagogy and classical studies in the two countries. When I was an undergraduate at Oxford, we were never told to read any translation. We were just reading the Greek, which partly meant that I then imprinted on the Greek rather than doing what many Americans do, which is imprint on a particular translation that they've read in high school. So the reading of Homer in translation, I think, is far more widespread in this country than it is in the UK, which I find often surprises American friends who sort of think of the British are so classically educated, but they actually are not. I think it's the Americans who are much more widely classically educated, because there's much more widespread sense that you should at least have read Homer in translation, whereas I think my British friends don't feel embarrassed if they haven't read Homer in translation, and they very often have not. There are also different conventions about which translations of ancient literature are more popular in the two countries. It's surprising to me also to see how in Britain, prose translation, explicitly prose translations of verse texts are very popular still. And very often the prose translations from the mid-20th century, like the E.V. View, sort of groundbreaking Penguin Classic translation of the Odyssey, which I think is an interesting translation and very much of its time, but is still read, and has great adherence and is still used for exams by British classical studies students. Whereas in this country, there's much more sense that the free verse American translations are the primary ones, and those are the best sellers. But I think there are also some differences in terms of the ways that Americans sort of see themselves and see the idea of being a warrior, of being a fighter, of being a hero. Those things have sort of catch on to the American imagination in a very different way because of the American superhero model and of the way that the American superhero model is tied up with the American military and the effects of American both culture wars and economic wars and real wars around the world. Whereas, of course, Britain is sort of, we know that we lost all the wars and that we're a post-empire kind of culture, so there's much more obvious suspicion of militarism and of heroes in Britain, and that affects how do people relate to the Odyssey and the Iliad.
Great answer.
Most of us probably wish you had been our teacher in high school who forced us to read these classics. Your animations today were wonderful. My question has to do with, when did you get interested in learning the classic Greek? We have a grandson now who's read the Odyssey and the Iliad and the New Testament, and he wants to learn ancient Greek. So how do you do that? How did you do it, and how do you do it now?
It's great that your grandson wants to learn Greek. I hope everyone who doesn't yet know Greek will leave today and go learn some Greek. It's really fun. So I got interested in the stories when I was when I was a child. My elementary school did a school play production of the Odyssey, and I got to be Athena, and I sort of realized, I kind of want to do this for the rest of my life. It's great. You get to dress up as a goddess, and it's fun. I read the kids' retellings, and then once I was in high school, I was lucky enough to go to a high school where they offered both Latin and ancient Greek. So I learned the languages first. I started learning them in high school, and then I went to Oxford, where I did nothing but read Latin and Greek for 4 years, and that was also really fun. Obviously, there were fewer opportunities, and not every high school is going to offer ancient Greek. There are also possibilities in terms of either finding an underemployed classicist who's willing to tutor your grandson. There are online tutors that you can find. I think there's lots of possibilities. The internet actually opens things up in terms of language learning, including for ancient languages.
We have time for one more question, I think. Yes? Okay.
I think as technology and globalization and modernity is like changing how we speak and becoming more simple, I wonder if your translation, did you kind of combat that, like the simplification of language and all of our understanding?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I'm not sure if I agree with the premise. I mean, I think there are obviously changes, and the speed of change with the internet and the speed of change in the way things pass through culture is different, and technology changes things. The Iliad itself is interested in technology, right? It's interested in the technology of how do people fight, and the technology of armor and weaponry, and it's also interested in the technology of rhetoric and words. And of course, these poems were composed when the new, at the time, technology of writing had just hit and was being used to create something more complicated than was possible within the oral tradition, out of the oral tradition, to create these monumental written poems. I mean, I think it's really important in an era of, you know, headlines, tweets, all that, to have there be places both to combat book bans, but also to encourage people of all ages to engage with big, difficult books, and to engage with that possibility of there are books that you can live in, and that you can be sort of inhabiting for days and weeks, and they're feeding your imagination. And the Iliad and the Odyssey are books like that, where it's combating both the simplisticness of just letting your reading primarily be one-liners or captions on TikTok, but that it's also combating the idea that we've got to be constantly only thinking about now, because there were also human beings 3,000 years ago, and they were just as human and just as complicated as we are.
Thank you.
That's just as human and just as complicated is a great place to start. There'll be a signing in books for sale. Oh, sorry.
Okay, and before you all rush off for the signing, which I hope you all will do, I just want to thank you on behalf of the festival, and I'm sure you'll join me again. This has been an absolutely amazing, multi-dimensional session. Not only have we had a focus on the monumental text, the Iliad, and a discussion about, or some discussion about its current relevance, we've had insight into the art of translation, and we've had amazing drama. Thank you both so much. I'd also like to reiterate our thanks to this afternoon's sponsors, Tom Taft, Kathleen Paramore, Michael Johnson, Martha and Orton Jackson. I hope you're all here, and thank you. And now I will tell you all about the book signing. So Buxton Books, our bookseller, most of you will have passed one of their tables on the way in. Both Emily and Judith will be signing books as soon as we can get them out of here. So the message from Buxton Books is that they would like you, if possible, to leave via the back doors, go via the auditorium, via the courtyard to the signing tables, where you'll meet both the authors who can personalize your books. And if you mislay your path, there'll be plenty of people around who can direct you to Judith and to Emily and to Buxton Books. And can we all thank them once again.